And this is where I think it's really important to think about even other types of stressors that create positive adaptations to the system that still control the amount of mechanical loading. Like a good example is, say, for instance, heat or cold therapy. Because, for instance, they can be, even cold therapy itself can be actually a very useful stimulus if applied in the appropriate setting, thinking about in terms of when it's done in regards to other types of training stimulus.
Yeah, and the question I have for you then is, do you think that there's a point where you can do too much of this metabolic loading? You know, we spoke about a conversation with one of our colleagues, Jeremy Weeks, you know, and he spoke about some papers that he'd been looking at that demonstrate that with distance runners, if they do too much aerobic training, these systems seem to be overloaded a little bit, and that's where you start to see immunological function actually start to deteriorate. You know, I think swimmers have a lot of problems with this, where obviously because swimming is non-weight bearing, the amount of swimming load and volume that they can do is enormous, right? Because the mechanical tension they're creating is not that high. But what then they have is that they can push their metabolic stress so high that their immunological function actually starts to...
And metabolic dysfunction itself. Well, like it's kind of two examples of the extremes, because, you know, for say your type of athletes, you need to try and control the amount of mechanical load. Well, put it more better, they need to expose themselves to very high mechanical loads, and the amount of actual metabolic stress that they're getting is going to be limited based on the parameters of the training that they're doing. So how can we apply metabolic stress with limiting the amount of mechanical stress? But on the other end of the spectrum, where, I mean, obviously long distance runners or swimmers is maybe a better example, where you're not applying as much mechanical stress, but you're certainly applying enough metabolic stress.
Yeah.
How do you find that balance between the two things?
I've been thinking about this a little bit because I have noticed this, and this is just an observation that I've made, but I've noticed this pattern where athletes who have gone into, say, a sprint sport like, you know, I deal with, track and field, and they have a history of playing, say, team sports, you know, AFL, soccer, basketball, whatever it is. And growing up, they had no injuries as they were participating in those things. But then as they specialized and only did those, you know, that very high mechanical load activity, even though they were training a lot and they were doing all the things that you would consider to be, you know, effective for the development of that sport, they would still have, say, a lot of, say, soft tissue injuries, or the recovery pattern would be slow.
Yeah.
And another example that I noticed of this was someone who I helped over a number of different seasons. They were playing soccer, and he'd grown up playing soccer. Then he decided he got really interested in the gym and sort of did a few years of powerlifting, put on a lot of muscle mass, got really strong, but wasn't doing really any sort of metabolic conditioning, wasn't really doing any sort of soccer play or anything like that. And then decided, okay, I'm going to go back to soccer. I enjoy playing it. He's playing local league, but just kept having injury after injury after injury. Even though if you measured him on all of his strength parameters, he was higher than all of his teammates. He was doing the preseason as it was set by, you know, the team, and at the time, and it's become very popular to do, you know, more intermittent, high intensity training for preparation for team sports, MAS type running, you know, maximum aerobic speed stuff, intervals, rather than the old school, like, go and do some jogging, go and do some of these underlying these metabolic kind of conditioning. And we actually did a couple of seasons of this, and he was getting so annoyed because he kept getting injured. And so I said to him, I was like, you know, I sat down with him, I said, okay, we need to start thinking this a little bit more broadly. I said, one of the things I think maybe you would really benefit from is going back and doing a pre-season, this next coming pre-season, where we actually do a lot more old school aerobic type conditioning. I was like, I want you to start jogging. I want you to start doing more of this. I want you to start doing more of that. more classical loading when it comes to your running for pre-season, and that was the best season he had by far in the previous 3 seasons. Nothing changed with his gym loading, nothing changed with his match play or soccer training. The big thing that changed was the way we structured the pre-season. And the more I think about that, the more it's like it was returning some of those metabolic features which had probably been heavily depleted when he decided he was going to undertake, powerlifting.
Yeah, and I think this is where it's important to think for an athlete, the more they specialize, the more there's that potential for divergence of, say, health and performance, because they're becoming much more specific with their training stimulus. I think it's one of the things we need to remember when you think about specificity of training. Like, absolutely, it's important. It's the fundamental element. But the more you become specific and you lose that diversity in training stimulus, the more limited your system becomes in terms of its ability to, what's the word I'm looking for? In terms of its diversity, I guess, is probably the better way to look at it. So I think that's a common error, or not error, but an issue that's associated with athletes, particularly if they work in a sport where there's very, very limited qualities that they need, is their particular training becomes more and more refined, and they lose the diversity within their system in general that actually makes